Have you ever found yourself in a heated moment? When your chest tightens, your mind races with words you want to throw into the air, yet you choose not to speak, not because you don't know what to say, but because you realize that saying it would change nothing, except perhaps your own peace. Silence can feel like surrender, but what if it's not? What if silence is not weakness, but wisdom in its most graceful form? In this video, we'll explore why silence can be the strongest answer you'll ever give. You'll learn the hidden psychology behind holding your tongue, how it protects your mind and relationships, and how to use it without feeling unheard. There's a moment in almost every argument when time seems to slow. The words being thrown at you start to lose their sharp edges, and instead of thinking about what's being said, you're thinking about what you want to say next. Your heartbeat quickens, your shoulders tense, you're ready to defend, to explain, to make the other person see your side. But then, something in you hesitates. Your mind flickers with a quiet thought. If I speak now, will it make anything better? That hesitation is the doorway to silence. And in that doorway, there's a choice. We often think of silence as the absence of action. But in reality, silence can be one of the most intentional actions we ever take. It's the pause that changes the direction of the conversation. It's the difference between escalating a fire and letting the embers die down. Imagine you're standing in front of someone you care about. A friend, a partner, a sibling. The conversation has shifted from lighthearted to tense. Their tone sharpens. Maybe they've misunderstood you. Maybe they're projecting their own frustrations onto you. Either way, your instinct is to respond immediately. Your mind starts building a counter-argument. You remember past moments where they did something similar, and you feel the urge to bring it up. But you also know, deep down, that if you speak now, it won't be to resolve the issue. It will be to win. That's the trap. In heated moments, most of us stop listening and start preparing our defense. And when we do, we stop connecting. Choosing silence here is not giving up. It's not letting the other person win. It's choosing to protect the relationship over your ego, at least in this moment. It's deciding that your peace matters more than being right. Silence in this form is active. It's you taking control of your nervous system, of your body's natural fight or flight response. Psychologists call this emotional regulation, the ability to notice your feelings, pause, and choose how you respond instead of reacting on autopilot. In practical terms, this might look like taking a slow breath before answering, letting the other person finish without interruption, even if you disagree with every word, looking away for a moment to gather your thoughts instead of blurting out something reactive. But here's the thing, silence isn't always comfortable. The first time you try it in a tense moment, you may feel your body vibrating with unsaid words. Your jaw might ache from holding them back. You might feel misunderstood, even powerless. That discomfort is the proof that silence matters. If it were easy, it wouldn't be powerful. In many ways, silence is like holding back the tide. Every part of you wants to rush forward, but you stand still. And in that stillness, you start to notice something. The other person's voice shifts. Their energy begins to change. They realize they're not being matched with equal force, and suddenly, they're left alone with their own words. Sometimes, they fill the silence themselves, explaining more, softening their tone, even correcting their own assumptions. Other times, they might still storm out or stay defensive. But you've stayed anchored. Silence, at its best, is not about controlling them. It's about controlling you. To understand why silence can be so powerful, we have to step inside the human mind, both yours and the other person's. Silence isn't simply not talking. It's a form of communication and often one of the most deliberate and sophisticated tools we have. 1. Silence as emotional regulation. When we're in conflict, our body's fight or flight system activates. The amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm bell, sounds off, flooding our system with adrenaline and cortisol. This is why our heart pounds, our breathing quickens, and our thoughts become sharper but also narrower. In this state, the brain is primed for survival, not connection. We are far more likely to say things we'll regret later, not because we're cruel people, but because our biology pushes us to defend ourselves at all costs. Silence interrupts this cascade. By not speaking immediately, you allow your prefrontal cortex, the rational, thoughtful part of your brain, to re-engage. You give yourself a few precious seconds for the emotional storm to pass, so that what you say next is chosen, not triggered. In psychology, this is called response inhibition, the conscious decision to pause before acting. It's a cornerstone of emotional intelligence and self-control. 2. Silence as boundary. Setting silence can also serve as a boundary without aggression. Words can be twisted, but silence is harder to manipulate. When you refuse to engage in escalating conflict, you signal, "I will not participate in this dynamic." In relationships, whether romantic, familial, or professional, this boundary can be vital. People often expect that the louder they get, the more likely they are to force a response. Silence disrupts this expectation. It tells them that your participation is optional and you won't be pulled into chaos. 3. The power dynamic of silence. Communication is a dance. We expect a rhythm. I speak, you respond, and back and forth we go. When one person breaks that rhythm by not responding immediately, it shifts the balance of power. This doesn't mean silence is about winning. It means you're no longer playing by the other person's tempo. You're taking control of the pace, which often creates space for reflection, both for them and for you. Think of it like a chess game. If you rush your moves, you miss opportunities. Silence is the equivalent of sitting back, looking at the board, and making your move only when it's most effective. 4. Cultural and personal conditioning. Not everyone experiences silence the same way. In some cultures, silence is a sign of respect or deep thought. In others, it's seen as avoidance or even defiance. Your own upbringing shapes how you perceive it. If you grew up in a household where conflict was constant and loud, silence may feel unnatural, like you're not defending yourself. If you grew up where feelings weren't discussed, silence might feel like a prison rather than a tool. Part of learning to use silence well is understanding your own conditioning. Do you equate talking with control? Do you fear that if you don't speak, you'll be walked over? Do you associate silence with safety or with tension? Knowing your internal wiring helps you decide when your silence is strength and when it's avoidance. 5. The psychological effect on the other person. When you choose silence in a heated moment, you're doing two things at once. You're managing your own emotions. You're creating a space the other person has to fill or sit with. That space can be uncomfortable, and discomfort is often where change happens. Without your immediate counterattack to latch onto, they're left to hear their own words more clearly. Sometimes this leads to self-correction. Other times, it simply gives them a chance to release their own emotions without making things worse for you. There's also something subtle at play. When you don't react, you become less predictable. This unpredictability can make others pause. They may start to weigh their words more carefully because they realize they can't simply trigger you into a knee-jerk response. 6. Silence and self-worth. Perhaps the most profound psychological root of healthy silence is self-worth. People who believe they must defend themselves at all times often do so because they're afraid of being misunderstood, disrespected, or diminished. But when you truly know your own value, you don't need every false accusation corrected, every misunderstanding cleared up in the moment. You can let silence speak for you because you know your worth isn't defined by someone else's perception. This doesn't mean letting lies stand unchallenged forever. It means choosing when and how to address them, so you act from strength rather than from fear. Years ago, I watched two colleagues, let's call them Daniel and Claire, argue over a project. Daniel raised his voice, cutting Claire off repeatedly, insisting she was wrong. I expected Claire to fight back. She was known for her sharp wit. But instead, she simply leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and listened. She didn't nod in agreement, she didn't roll her eyes, she didn't even pick up her pen, she just waited. Daniel's voice, which had started loud and fast, began to slow. He stumbled over his points. Eventually, he stopped talking altogether. The silence stretched. Then Claire said, in a calm voice, "Are you done?" It wasn't sarcasm. It was an honest question, and in that moment, the whole energy of the room shifted. The argument ended, not with one side crushed, but with both realizing the heat had burned itself out. That's the root power of silence. It's not passive, it's active. It shapes the conversation, the power dynamic, and even the emotional state of both people. Part 3. The impact of silence on relationships. Healing versus hurting. Silence is a double-edged sword. In the right hands, it can heal, de-escalate, and create room for growth. In the wrong hands, or in the wrong moment, it can deepen wounds, fuel misunderstandings, and quietly erode trust. Understanding the difference between these two outcomes is essential because silence isn't inherently good or bad. It's neutral. The meaning we attach to it depends on why it's used and how it's received. 1. Silence that heals. In healthy relationships, silence is like a breath between musical notes. It gives the melody space to breathe. It allows for reflection, digestion of emotions, and a calmer re-entry into dialogue. A partner who says, "I need a moment to think before I respond," is using silence as an act of care. This pause shows they value the relationship enough to avoid impulsive words that could wound. Even outside of conflict, silence can strengthen bonds. Sitting together in companionable quiet, reading, watching the rain, or simply being, can build intimacy without the pressure of constant conversation. In these moments, silence says, "I feel safe enough with you to not fill every second with noise." 2. Silence that hurts. The same act of not speaking can also be an emotional weapon. When silence is used to punish, control, or withdraw affection, it becomes the infamous silent treatment. Unlike a healthy pause, the silent treatment isn't about processing. It's about making the other person feel small, confused, or desperate for approval. This kind of silence isn't a bridge, it's a wall. It leaves the other person guessing at what they did wrong, sometimes replaying entire conversations in their head, looking for clues. And because it withholds communication entirely, it robs the relationship of the oxygen it needs to survive. Over time, weaponized silence can cause more damage than shouting ever could. It breeds resentment and insecurity, teaching people to walk on eggshells rather than trust and open dialogue. 3. How to tell the difference. The difference between healing silence and hurtful silence often comes down to intention and communication. Healing silence is announced or understood. "I need a bit of time to think. I'll come back to this." Hurtful silence is unexplained and indefinite. You can also feel the difference in your body. Healing silence feels like a pause. Hurtful silence feels like a freeze. In a pause, you expect to return to connection. In a freeze, you brace for abandonment. 4. The role of timing. Even the healthiest silence can backfire if it's prolonged past its purpose. Think of it like holding your breath. You can do it for a short while to regain focus, but if you never inhale again, you suffocate. Similarly, a pause in conversation to cool down is healthy, but disappearing for days without explanation is not. The goal is balance, enough space for emotions to settle, but not so much that it creates distance you can't close again. 5. Silence as an invitation. Silence can be an open door instead of a closed one. Sometimes the most supportive thing you can do for someone in pain is simply to be there without pressing them to talk. Psychologists call this holding space, providing presence without judgment, allowing the other person to share when they're ready. A grieving friend might not have words for their pain yet, and your quiet companionship can say more than a dozen well-meant platitudes ever could. In this way, silence becomes an unspoken message. You don't have to perform your pain for me. I believe it's real. I'm here. 6. Cultural nuances in relationship silence. In some cultures, especially in parts of East Asia, silence in relationships is a sign of harmony. It's a way of preserving peace and respecting others' emotions. In other cultures, like in the West, silence may be perceived as emotional neglect or avoidance. These differences matter in relationships, especially cross-cultural ones. Misinterpretations are common. One person may believe they're showing respect by staying quiet, while the other feels shut out or unloved. Bridging this gap requires explicit discussion about how each person views and uses silence. N. A story of two friends. Consider Emma and Lucas. Emma grew up in a family where every disagreement was talked out immediately, often loudly, but always with resolution. Lucas, on the other hand, grew up in a household where silence was the default during tension. One evening, Emma confronted Lucas about a comment he made that hurt her. Lucas went quiet, looking away. Emma's heart began to race. She thought he was shutting down the friendship, but Lucas wasn't angry. He was thinking. In his mind, speaking too soon would only make things worse. The misunderstanding came from unspoken expectations. Emma needed to hear, "I just need a few minutes." Lucas needed to learn that total silence without context made Emma feel abandoned. When they finally talked about it, the friendship grew stronger. Emma began to appreciate Lucas's thoughtfulness. Lucas learned to signal his intentions. Silence remained a part of their friendship, but now it was a shared tool, not a secret weapon. 8. Silence and self-protection in toxic relationships. In unhealthy or abusive dynamics, silence can be a survival strategy. Responding to every provocation may only escalate danger. In such cases, silence becomes a shield, buying time or avoiding harm. But here's the risk. If you carry that same habit into safe, healthy relationships, it can prevent intimacy. What once protected you may now isolate you. This is why healing often requires relearning how to use your voice, not abandoning silence, but using it selectively and intentionally. 9. Choosing silence as a statement. In certain situations, speaking out would only dignify cruelty. When someone makes a comment meant to provoke or belittle you, silence can say, "Your words aren't worth my energy." This is especially effective when paired with calm body language, steady eye contact, relaxed posture, because it communicates confidence rather than avoidance. The silence says, "I see you, I hear you, and I choose not to engage." It's not about bottling up your feelings, it's about refusing to play a game you didn't agree to. 10. The most important rule. Silence should never be a substitute for truth. There comes a point when something must be said, when holding it back is no longer protective but corrosive. The key is discernment, knowing when silence is wisdom and when it's fear disguised as wisdom. As one therapist put it, silence can be the highest form of self-respect or the deepest form of self-abandonment. The difference is whether you're using it to protect your dignity or to avoid your truth. Part 4. Turning the silence into a tool for connection and self-mastery. Silence, when misunderstood, feels like a void. But when we understand its psychology and practice it with intention, it transforms from an empty space into a container, a place where truth can grow without being trampled by the noise of haste or ego. This is not about avoiding life or withdrawing from the people we love. It's about using silence to protect what matters most: clarity, dignity, and emotional balance. Here's how you can make silence your ally. 1. Start with self-awareness. Silence begins inside your mind before it manifests outside. Many people think of silence as simply not speaking, but internally, they're still running a frantic dialogue, replaying arguments, or planning comebacks. That's not true silence. It's just noise with the volume turned inward. Before using silence outwardly, practice it inwardly. This could be as simple as pausing mid-thought and asking yourself, what am I feeling right now? Am I reacting from hurt, anger, or ego? Would speaking now serve me or just feed the fire? True silence is intentional. It's the space where you take back control from your impulses. 2. Signal your intentions. Silence without context can feel like rejection. If you're using silence to pause in a conversation or relationship, signal it. Simple phrases like, "I need a few minutes to think." "I'm not ready to answer yet, but I will." "Let me sit with that before I respond." This keeps silence from being mistaken as punishment. It shifts it from a cold wall to a respectful boundary. You're not closing the door. You're just taking time before walking through it. 3. Pair silence with presence. Silence isn't about checking out. It's about tuning in more deeply. When someone is speaking, resist the urge to mentally prepare your reply. Instead, listen with your full attention. Eyes steady, posture open, mind curious. This kind of listening silence builds trust because it says, "I'm here for you, not just waiting for my turn to speak." Psychologists call this active listening, but at its core, it's the art of giving someone your full, undivided presence. 4. Use silence to break the cycle of escalation. Arguments often escalate because both parties feed off each other's reactivity. One sharp word triggers another, and soon, you're miles away from the original issue. Silence disrupts this spiral. By pausing instead of firing back, you take the oxygen out of the conflict. Your stillness says, "I won't let this moment define us." In many cases, the other person's intensity will naturally fade when they no longer have something to push against. 5. Replace retaliation with reflection. Imagine someone insults you at work. Your first instinct might be to defend yourself or throw an insult back. Instead, choose a moment of silence, not the kind where you storm off, but the kind where you meet their gaze, breathe slowly, and say nothing. That silence buys you time. It allows you to decide, is this worth my energy? Will my response change anything? Or will it just feed their satisfaction? More often than not, silence will reveal that the insult says more about them than it ever could about you. 6. Make silence a daily practice. Like any skill, using silence requires practice. Start small. Take a few minutes each morning to sit without your phone, without music, without speaking. Just notice your breath and surroundings. When someone shares a story, pause for 2 seconds before responding. It shows you've absorbed their words instead of rushing to fill the space. At the end of the day, spend 5 minutes reflecting in silence. Ask yourself, did I speak from my values today or from my impulses? These micro practices make it easier to call on silence when it matters most. 7. Recognize when silence is avoidance. One of the hardest truths is admitting that sometimes our silence isn't wisdom, it's fear. We avoid a conversation because we don't want to face discomfort. We withhold words because we're afraid of conflict, rejection, or vulnerability. Avoidant silence corrodes relationships because it leaves wounds unaddressed. Healing silence, in contrast, is temporary and purposeful. It's a pause before engagement, not a permanent retreat. If you notice your silence stretching into weeks or months without resolution, it's worth asking, am I protecting my peace or just hiding from my truth? 8. Use silence as an act of self-respect. When someone tries to drag you into gossip, drama, or manipulation, silence can be a statement of self-worth. You don't need to explain why you're not engaging. Your refusal to participate speaks volumes. This is not passive. It's a conscious act of protecting your mental energy. You are choosing not to carry words that were never yours to bear. 9. Lean on silence in moments of beauty. Not all silence is about conflict. Sometimes it's about awe. Standing before a sunset, holding a sleeping child, or hearing a piece of music that moves you to tears. These are moments where words would only diminish the experience. In relationships, shared silence during beauty is deeply bonding. You're telling the other person, we don't have to talk to feel close. In a world that glorifies constant chatter, that kind of connection is rare and precious. 10. Let silence teach you patience. We live in a culture that prizes instant responses. Text back now, post your opinion now, solve it now. But silence reminds us that not everything needs an immediate answer. Some truths emerge only with time. If you can sit in silence without rushing to fill it, you'll find that many situations resolve themselves naturally. A misunderstood text becomes less urgent by morning. A decision that felt impossible yesterday feels clear after a night of rest. Silence creates that space for clarity to rise. 11. A closing story. The man who waited. There was once a teacher known for his ability to settle even the fiercest disputes. One day, 2 neighbors came to him, each furious with the other. They shouted over one another, demanding he take sides. The teacher said nothing. After an hour, one man stormed off. The other stayed, breathing heavily, waiting for a judgment. The teacher still said nothing. Finally, the second man grew tired and left. The next day, both neighbors returned, calmer and embarrassed. The teacher smiled and said, "Yesterday, you wanted me to decide who was right, but I decided instead to wait until you both could hear." His silence didn't avoid the problem. It prepared the ground for resolution. Part 5. The Echo. After the silence. If you've ever sat by a lake in the early morning, you know there's a difference between quiet and stillness. Quiet is the absence of noise. Stillness is the absence of turbulence. The surface of the water doesn't just stop moving, it mirrors the world above it with perfect clarity. That's what true silence feels like inside us. Not an empty pause, not a forced withholding, but a space so steady that it can finally reflect reality as it is. We live in a world that rewards the loudest voice, the quickest reply, the cleverest comeback. But the truth is, wisdom often lives in the space between words. It lives in the moments when we resist the reflex to defend ourselves, to explain, to fill every gap with sound. That space, the one most people fear, is where your power gathers. The cost of constant talking. Every word you speak is a small investment of your energy, your emotional capital. But here's what no one tells you. Every unnecessary word is also a withdrawal. It pulls from the reserves you need for when it really matters. Silence, when chosen with care, is not the absence of contribution. It's the protection of your most valuable currency, attention. Think of the people you know who rarely speak, but when they do, the whole room turns to listen. They haven't built that power by accident. They've built it by letting their silence sharpen their presence. Each unsaid word polishes the ones they eventually choose to release. The healing nature of withheld words. There is a form of damage that comes not from what we say, but from saying too much, too soon, in the wrong state of mind. Words spoken in anger become splinters in the memory of someone you love. You might apologize later, but an apology doesn't erase the echo of what was said. Silence, intentional silence, buys you time to let the storm pass before you open your mouth. It gives you space to ask, if I say this, will it build a bridge or burn one? Will it add understanding or just add heat? And sometimes that pause will save you from creating a wound that takes years to heal. When silence speaks louder than truth. There are truths that don't need to be voiced to be known. You've probably felt it before. Someone wronged you, but instead of explaining yourself or defending your innocence, you simply step back. In that moment, you stop performing for their understanding. And without you feeding the stage, their performance collapses. This is why silence feels so unnerving to those who seek control. It removes their script. Without your participation, they're left to face themselves. And whether they admit it or not, silence forces them to see the reflection they've been avoiding. Silence and boundaries. In psychology, boundaries are the invisible lines that protect our mental and emotional well-being. Silence is one of the most underrated tools for enforcing them. You don't have to attend every argument you're invited to. You don't have to explain every no. You don't have to keep giving more words to someone who consistently distorts them. Choosing silence in these moments doesn't mean you've given up. It means you've stopped negotiating with someone who was never bargaining in good faith. You're not walking away from the truth. You're walking toward peace. The courage to sit with discomfort. The hardest part about using silence isn't the pause. It's surviving the discomfort it creates. We fear being misunderstood. We fear seeming weak. We fear that if we don't speak up right now, the moment to be heard will be gone forever. But here's the paradox. When you can sit with that discomfort without rushing to end it, you train your nervous system to stop treating every conflict as a crisis. You start to understand that not all fires need to be put out instantly. Some burn themselves out when there's no fuel left to feed them. A story about silence that changed everything. There's a woman I once knew who went through a bitter divorce. Every meeting with her ex turned into a war of words. Accusations, interruptions, shouting over each other. One day, in the middle of another heated argument, she simply stopped. She sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and said nothing. Her ex grew louder, trying to provoke a reaction, but she remained still. After a few minutes, his voice began to falter. He realized he was arguing with his own echo. That was the turning point. From that day forward, she spoke only when it was about facts, never about feelings, never about the past. Her silence didn't erase the pain, but it removed her from the game. It ended his control over her emotions. She told me later, silence was the first thing that made me feel like myself again. Silence as a mirror. When you practice intentional silence, something surprising happens. You start hearing your own thoughts more clearly. The constant noise of reaction fades, and you begin to notice patterns. How often your defensiveness comes from insecurity. How many of your arguments are fueled by wanting to be right rather than wanting to find peace? Silence holds up a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see. But if you have the courage to look, you'll find not only your triggers, but also your strength. The echo that stays. After the words fade, after the moment passes, what's left is the echo. With noise, the echo is just more noise. But with silence, the echo is clarity. People remember the way you didn't rise to bait. They remember how you stayed grounded when others lost their footing. And more importantly, you remember that you didn't betray yourself for the sake of winning a moment. Bringing it all together, silence is not about absence. It's about choice. It's not about closing your voice forever. It's about knowing when your voice will have the most impact. It's not about power over others. It's about mastery over yourself. The next time you feel the urge to rush into words, pause. Let silence hold the space for you. Let it teach you what needs to be said, and what is better left unsaid. In that pause, you might find the answer you were chasing in all the noise. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can say is nothing at all. If this spoke to you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you'd like more conversations like this, about the quiet ways we can reclaim our lives, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. I read everyone.